My name is Dave Riley, and I'm the Chair of Political Science at Niagara University. Happy Dingus Day. Well, it was yesterday, but I'll take advantage of the opportunity to wish you all a happy spring, new beginnings, new opportunities, and hopefully a life what we might call back to normal. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. What does it mean for life to get back to normal in an international relations context? In international relations, it's often best characterized by power struggles, by exploitation and domination, cooperation, meaningful cooperation, cooperation that is enduring and lasting, often doesn't exist. It occurs fleetingly at best and often lacks enforcement mechanisms that would actually compel states to behave in a particular way that works for the benefit of all. So what does this mean in the context of the pandemic? A moment in time characterized by uncertainty, drastic changes to health, to economics, and potentially much more. There's absolutely no question that this pandemic has and will continue to have critical impacts on health, on the economy, on governmental and social stability. David Kilcullen, a counterinsurgency expert and author of The Dragons and the Snakes, How the West Learned to Fight the Rest, is quoted in a recent Intercept article as saying, once the impacts of the virus really start to hit developing countries, we are going to see a whole new crop of instability. He warns it could be the crisis that reorders world systems. It is unprecedented in its scale and global in its reach. And this is really important to consider. Developed countries, including the United States, could see their GDPs shrink by as much as 25 to 30% in the coming months. And developing countries could be actually much worse off. The UNDP, the development program, sees an economic conflict as a result of this pandemic, leading to as much as $220 billion in losses for these states. According to The Intercept, again, in addition to large numbers of people who could die as a result of insufficient medical care and sanitation, the financial impact of the virus, absent sufficient outside assistance, may prove an impossible burden on countries where social stability has already been precarious. They suggest that the political fallout in the form of unrest and migration could rival or even dwarf the experiences that occurred in the Arab Spring. So in the midst of all of this, the greatest losses to our international system and to the states and the people who populate them could be democracy and cooperation. The Washington Post recently listed off countries where democratic policies and procedures have been compromised during this pandemic. France and Bolivia have postponed their elections. Peru handed its president broad new legislative authority. Israel sharply ramped up its reach of the surveillance state. Hungary, which last month handed Prime Minister Viktor Orban near dictatorial powers. And in Belgium even, authorities have requisitioned cell phone companies' location tracking data to make sure people aren't straying too far from home. Douglas Rootson, president of the Washington-based International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, said COVID-19 is not only a public health crisis, it is also a political crisis. Governments around the world are assembling emergency powers that they will be reluctant to relinquish, and over time, emergency powers seep into the fabric of society. You see this throughout history, he concludes. Let's examine all of this. Walk with me, and let's talk about coronavirus, competition, and conflict. An opinion piece in Bloomberg starts by saying that the most misleading cliche about the coronavirus is that it treats us all the same. It doesn't, neither medically nor economically, socially, or psychologically. In particular, COVID-19 exacerbates pre-existing conditions of inequality wherever it arrives. Before long, this will cause social turmoil, up to and including revolutions. In the US, the wealthy are able to isolate and quarantine by heading off to their yachts or their houses in the Hamptons. The poor, though, are not able to isolate in the same way. Many of the poorest and even the middle class in America don't have this option. The less money you make, the less likely you are to be able to work remotely. Lacking savings and health insurance, these workers are in precarious employment, and they have to keep their jobs, if they're lucky enough to have them, just to make ends meet. So what this means is they risk getting infected, they risk bringing the virus home to their families, and many of them don't have the health insurance to be able to deal with the consequences of these illnesses should they receive them. So the coronavirus is moving fastest through neighborhoods that are cramped, stressful, and bleak. And that certainly also has a racial component to it, which I will go back to later on. Between nations, these differences are also exacerbated. As I mentioned in an earlier video, those living in India or South Africa, there's no such thing as social distancing for them in most cases, because the whole family sleeps in one room. There's no discussion about whether to wear masks because those masks are not available. More hand washing is good advice, but if you don't have running water, it's not an option. The International Labor Organization has warned that the pandemic will destroy 195 million jobs worldwide and drastically cut the income of another 1.25 billion people, most of whom were already poor. As their suffering worsens, so do other scourges, from alcoholism and drug addiction to domestic violence and child abuse, leaving whole populations traumatized, perhaps permanently. In this context, it would be naive to think that once this medical emergency is over, either individual countries or the world can carry on as before. Anger and bitterness will find new outlets. The Bloomberg editorial ends with the conclusion that what we may be seeing is the start of a revolutionary era, where we see massive populations rising up against their governments and claiming the need and the necessity of change immediately. It's interesting because in the international systems theory that exists out there, we tend to think of cooperation as being most likely to occur in the midst of a conflict and a crisis. And yet in this situation, we seem to be seeing quite the opposite. We see states hunkering down and engaging in greater conflict and greater competition than ever before. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights warned last week that the coronavirus pandemic is likely to widen existing inequalities around the world if left unchecked, with the poor, the disabled, the homeless, minorities, women, and elderly among the most at risk. The High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, also had stern criticism for governments that she said are using health emergency measures to justify repression and expansion of their powers. Civil and political rights are being threatened by governments that are abusing the emergency measures they are taking to respond to this public health crisis. As she said, "I'm profoundly concerned by certain countries' adoption of emergency powers that are unlimited and not subject to review. In a few cases, the epidemic is being used to justify repressive changes to regular legislation, which will remain in force long after the emergency is over. I'm also concerned by steps taken to impose restrictions on media, freedom, and freedom of expression." She said journalists, health workers, state officials, and ordinary people are being penalized for criticizing governments for doing a poor job in fighting the coronavirus. All of this behavior is consistent with a competitive, conflictual response to the crisis. Let's be more specific. What does conflict and competition look like in the midst of a pandemic? Number one, it looks like people going hungry. We've seen pictures recently of record numbers of people seeking help and miles of cars waiting for food. San Antonio, Pittsburgh, Inglewood, Chicago, Sunrise, Florida were among the many cities with packed roads leading to local facilities, massive amounts of food to be distributed and not enough for the people who need them. In the midst of this, there are reports in the New York Times that food banks across the country are facing enormous shortfalls in the face of increasing demand, despite donations that have come in. So Feeding America, the nation's largest network of food banks, has more than 200 affiliates, but they have a $1.4 billion projected shortfall in the next 6 months alone. Of course, savior Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, announced that he was donating $100 million to the group, the single largest donation in its history, an enormous amount of money, no question, but still less than 1/10 of what it needs. And let me ask you this, is this what a solution looks like in a world of capitalism? In January 2019, Business Insider calculated that Jeff Bezos makes, are you ready for this, roughly $4.5 million every hour, making his donation to Feeding America, that $100 million donation, the equivalent of about 22 and a half hours of work for him. Note that as well, while people are going hungry and there isn't enough food to serve these many people who are in need, there is ample food being produced. A New York Times article from April 11th reported that in Wisconsin and Ohio, farmers are dumping thousands of gallons of fresh milk. An Idaho farmer dug huge ditches to bury 1 million pounds of onions. And in South Florida, a region that supplies much of the eastern half of the United States with produce, tractors are crisscrossing beans and cabbage fields, plowing perfectly ripe vegetables back into the soil. So at the same time that we have shortages in grocery stores and people are going hungry, farmers are destroying tens of millions of pounds of fresh food that they can no longer sell. In the United States, the government is taking advantage of the diverted public attention in 6 very important ways. First, they have stopped regulating and protecting the environment. On March 27th, it was reported by PBS that the Environmental Protection Agency abruptly waived enforcement on a range of legally mandated public health and environmental protections, saying, and I quote, industries could have trouble complying with them during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the oil and the gas industries were among the industries that had asked for this relaxation of environmental and public health enforcement during the outbreak, citing potential staffing problems. But the EPA's decision was sweeping, forgoing fines or other civil penalties for companies that fail to monitor, to report, or to meet some other requirements for releasing hazardous pollutants. This move was the latest and one of the broadest regulation easing moves by the EPA, which has been seeking to roll back dozens of regulations as part of Donald Trump's purge of rules that the administration sees as unfriendly to business. And it's led now by Wheeler, who was ahead of the coal industry. Former EPA Chief Gina McCarthy, now president of the National Resources Defense Council, called the announcement an open license to pollute. Second, we're seeing greater privatization. And the obvious example, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, is the post office. At a time when the United States is bailing out the cruise line industry, it doesn't see the need, or it's arguing that we shouldn't be subsidizing the post office as a critical resource and asset for the United States. There's an attempt to expand laws that allow for arbitrary and indefinite detention. This is the third category. So in late March, a Politico article revealed that the Justice Department has quietly asked Congress for the ability to ask judges to detain people indefinitely without trial during emergencies, as part of a push for new powers that comes as the novel coronavirus spreads throughout the United States. This includes statute of limitations, asylum, and the way court hearings are conducted. All of their requests are a great expansion of government control and power without oversight. The fourth is colonizing the moon. Yes, the moon, that's right. Trump's recent executive order from last week states, and I quote, outer space is a legally and physically unique domain of human activity, and the United States does not view it as a global commons. Now, this is an entirely different perspective from the way the United States has viewed space in the past, and I'll talk about this in another video altogether. Wildlife refuges are the fifth Wildlife refuges in the United States are under assault during this pandemic. There's an expansion of GMO crops allowed on wildlife refuges, which will inevitably be accompanied by pesticides and herbicides in these lands. And there's also an attempt to expand hunting in these protected areas at this time. So while China is stepping back, albeit in a minor way, their exploitation of wildlife in the midst of this pandemic, the United States is expanding it. And the sixth, and potentially the most important, is the increasing of surveillance. So the rationales for surveillance are easy to understand within certain limits. Public health authorities battling the pandemic want to know who is spreading the virus, which people may have become infected, and the movement of those individuals potentially carrying the bug. China, where the COVID-19 outbreak began, leveraged its already deeply intrusive system of social control to force people to install cell phone apps that assign them a code according to allegedly their perceived risk of spreading contagion. And their ability to travel or enter public spaces is defined by that code. South Korea didn't go as far as China, but it still tracked people's cell phones and credit card usages. Officials also used surveillance cameras to monitor their movements. Emulating a Chinese tactic, Spanish authorities have used aerial drones to detect unauthorized gatherings of people. Here in the US, our government officials joined with tech companies to look through location data that most of us share with cell phone apps. The idea is to determine if people are staying at home as ordered. If not, the information detects where we're clustering. So privacy rules have also been relaxed to allow easier sharing of patients' medical records with government health officials. And some government agencies are attaching GPS ankle monitors to COVID-19 patients and those suspected of exposure, lest they go for a walk in the country or pick up groceries from a curbside. A Canadian company, Dragonfly, is touting a drone that can, and I quote, from a distance determine fever, which is much different than determining just temperature, cough detection, respiratory rate, heart rate, and blood pressure. In the US, local public health authorities already review social media for information about foodborne illness to target and close suspect eateries. The Surveillance Technology Oversight Project say we should expect the same technique to eventually be applied to the pandemic. So in most cases, these big brother types of behaviors have been sold as temporary measures in the midst of this crisis. The question is, can we take government officials at their word that they will abandon these once the pandemic is over? Edward Snowden, in a recent interview with Vice News on April 9th, said, and I quote, "As authoritarianism spreads, as emergency laws proliferate, as we sacrifice our rights, we also sacrifice our capability to arrest the slide into a less liberal and less free world. Do you truly believe that when the first wave, the second wave, the 16th wave of the coronavirus is a long forgotten memory, that these capabilities will not be kept? That these data sets will not be kept? No matter how it is being used, what is being built is the architecture of oppression." In short, at a time when cooperation is most needed, we're seeing governments ignore the collective public needs and focus on their own self-interest. And this is not limited to the United States. To review a few international headlines, we see that these self-interested behaviors are happening in much of the world. Here are a few headlines. Palestinians plead for lifting of Gaza blockade as coronavirus tests run out. Italy to close ports to migrant aid ships. Asylees in Greece must remain in camps. Hundreds of Bolivians trapped in quarantine as Chile seals border. But certainly the United States is at the forefront of this type of behavior. On April 1st, no joke, the United States doubled its military assets in the Caribbean as part of its confrontation with the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro. For the past 15 months, the administration has applied what they call, quote, maximum pressure on Maduro's regime, with the hope that the upper echelons of the military, the regime's main pillar of support, would fracture and trigger a return to democracy, as they call it. On Wednesday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reaffirmed the administration's commitment to replacing Mr. Maduro. and that followed the sending of troops to that area. April 8th, U.S. Air Force fighter jets intercepted 2 Russian patrol aircraft near Alaska on Wednesday, North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, announced. Now, this is a conflict that works in both directions. Russia may be testing the will of the United States right now to patrol its own borders, but the response was very aggressive and follows another example, or actually precedes another example. On April 10th, a U.S. Navy-guided missile destroyer sailed through the sensitive Taiwan Straits on Friday. The U.S. and Taiwan militaries said the same day that Chinese fighter jets drilled in waters close to the democratically ruled island. So you have small skirmishes with Russia, with China, sending our assets out to confront Venezuela. And in the midst of all of this, the United States is still resisting easing sanctions on Iran during the global coronavirus pandemic, despite calls from the international community, including former U.S. government officials, to do so for humanitarian reasons. The coronavirus there has infected more than 64,000 people and killed nearly 4,000, among the highest fatality rates in the world. And, as I mentioned earlier, the United States is accelerating a new space race to the moon, and the potential of new imperialism on a galactic scale. There is absolutely no question that this virus puts some of the most vulnerable populations at risk. We know about the unhealthy, the elderly, the poor, but traditionally marginalized groups as well are being disproportionately affected. And so we can think about the racism of this. In Michigan and Illinois, African Americans make up 14 to 15% of the population, but according to Democracy Now! Account for 41% of the COVID-19 deaths. In Chicago alone, African Americans account for 70% of the city's deaths, yet only 30% of the population. In Louisiana, African Americans comprise about a third of the population, but 70% of the COVID-19 deaths. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who called the coronavirus the Great Equalizer, said Wednesday that Black people make up 18% of the deaths in the state, despite the fact that they only make up 9% of the state's population. The Latino community makes up 29% of New York City, but 34% of the deaths, many of them in Queens, the most diverse community in the nation. The actual number of deaths due to COVID-19 will likely never be known because many of those on the margins of society are dying at home. And it's important to note that incarcerated populations are also suffering at an incredibly unequal rate. In fact, within prisons and jails, the populations there have some of the highest rates of the coronavirus and are receiving some of the worst medical assistance of any of the populations in the world. Axios summed up this situation succinctly by describing the pandemic as, I quote, a Darwinian moment where the strong in business, wealth, and health are more likely to survive, while many others will sadly wither. This may seem like hyperbole, but consider that the pandemic is exposing and deepening many of the nation's great divides. This crisis reveals the nation's haves and have-nots, as who you are, who you know, and where you live can make the difference in everything, including life and death. So think about this. Many of the people who are disproportionately hurt by the virus have the least control over or say within the system. It's predominantly the old and previously or already ill who are getting hit the hardest. We've seen healthcare inequities that are being exacerbated in communities of color, and low-income families are bearing the brunt. All week, we saw a stream of new data showing shockingly disproportionate tolls among African Americans, as I described before. But the imbalance transcends demographics. Those without health insurance are less likely to get tested or to seek treatment, increasing their mortality rate. Those with weak governors or mayors, slow to react or stubborn to face reality, will suffer and die from belated social distancing and stay-at-home mandates. And we saw in South Dakota one of the worst examples of this just over this past week. Those with strong health and immune systems are likelier to survive. Here, as in Italy, it's likely those who develop the strong antibody that defeats the virus will be first back to work and to return to normal life. So the Darwinian dynamic feels particularly acute for business. Millions of companies and jobs will be wiped away, with mainly the strong or the well-connected able to hang on. Those companies with strong connections and lobbyists will get bailouts to stay alive. Those smaller businesses that have good connections to banks will be the first in line for government money to stay afloat. Those with strong balance sheets and not inflated paper value or hype will thrive and attract more emergency capital from investors. Mom and pop shops with good local businesses but thin margins will struggle mightily, and many will go under without substantial aid delivered quickly. Those workers who can easily transition to remote work, and we already talked about the fact that those are the wealthiest, will be fine. Those in blue-collar jobs that can only be done in person are not only more vulnerable to the virus, but also losing their jobs and their insurance. This is also an international pandemic. Axios focused on the US situation, but there are international consequences. Oxfam reports that the coronavirus pandemic could push an additional 600 million people into poverty unless urgent action is taken to bail out poor countries. They recommend that world leaders fund a $2.5 trillion rescue package to prevent global economic collapse, that governments cancel $1 trillion of poor countries' debts to free up cash. And without this assistance, Oxfam warns that half of all jobs in Africa could be lost to the pandemic. A great example of this who you know makes a difference concept is the example of DuPont Chemical. This giant corporation based in the United States convened a crisis team in January to figure out how to ramp up their global production of personal protective equipment, PPE, including suits made of Tyvek, which normally sells for about $5 a piece at hospitals. By early March, as the disease began to spread in the United States, DuPont's factory was cranking out Tyveks. How? It usually takes 3 months to ship the material to Vietnam, where it's sewn into bodysuits and then returned back to the United States. When the federal government offered to pay for chartered flights to reduce the round trip for 750,000 orders, DuPont agreed. Sounds great, right? Until you realize that DuPont sold only 60% of that protective gear back to the United States, while keeping 40% for other customers. They didn't say how much was paid for those suits, but a spokesperson said that they sold them for about $15 each, which is 3 times the amount that they normally were selling for. And speaking of the Supply Chain Task Force, the committee includes Jared Kushner and friends of his. According to the an MSN report from last week, this committee pushed aside the federal existing emergency management response teams that had long established methods for engaging assistance from the public and private sectors. Instead, and I quote, they first reached out to personal contacts, according to people familiar with their operations. To the extent that they had absorbed some of the old practices over the course of time, with the help of career officials intent on bringing their actions in line with protocol, it has taken time to figure out their own system. Jared and his friends decided they were going to do their thing, I quote, said the senior government official involved in the response effort. And it ended up costing us weeks of response time. The article goes on to cite multiple examples of this reworking of processes, and all of those around this kind of friends and family at the expense of response time and effectiveness. This Darwinian self-interest at the expense of the most vulnerable seems to go with Kushner wherever and whenever he surfaces. On April 11th, The Intercept reported that Kushner's real estate holdings company has been engaging in debt collection, threats of litigation, and preparing eviction lawsuits against tenants on his properties. Machiavellian capitalism is not unique to Kushner, of course. Some of the biggest banks on Wall Street have been intimidating their traders to come back to work, despite an executive order from the governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo, ordering people to remain at home during the coronavirus outbreak. Counterpunch reported on April 10th that while the Wall Street traders have taken on greater health risks of catching the coronavirus by traveling to work on mass transit and working in a potentially contaminated building, some of the biggest banks will collect a death benefit should the employees die from the virus. Wall Street banks own a form of insurance called BOLI, short for bank-owned life insurance. The death benefit pays to the corporate owner of the policy, in this case the banks, not the employee or their family. Because it's a life insurance policy, it has a lot of nice perks for the bank's bottom line. The cash benefit of the policy builds up tax-free while the policy is in force, and the paid death benefit is free of federal income tax. The bank is supposed to get the employee's death benefit permission before taking out the policy, but there's little evidence that employees know what they're signing when a huge stack of papers is pushed in front of them on their hire date. As of December 31st, 2019, 4 of the largest U.S. banks, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup's Citibank, held a combined $58.44 billion worth of BOLI assets. Experts suggest that that amount could represent approximately $584 billion in future death benefits, or more than $500 billion. We can contrast this predatory behavior that I just described, the Darwinian capitalism, with the emergence of mutual aid networks across the country. As the government response to the pandemic has faltered in many places, mutual aid projects, including a staple of social movements for decades, are rising up to meet basic needs of the population. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now because I will try and do a separate video specifically on these mutual aid networks in future. In his assessment of the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, friend and blogger of Macro for the Masses, Gabriel Agostini, argues that aside from meaningful provisions for the unemployed and small businesses, the biggest beneficiaries of government welfare will be corporate America. And I quote, demonstrating once again that no developed country does socialism for the rich better than the United States. Although this act leads to meaningful expansion of unemployment insurance and one-time checks to support the unemployed, relief is slow and inadequate for working-class Americans. Helping the unemployed is good, but keeping workers employed is better, and the CARES Act does not do enough in this regard. Our institutions work really well for the rich and well-connected, so the corporate sector will be receiving a mega bailout. CARES Act conditions for corporate welfare are weak at best and non-existent at worst. Without significant strings attached, a big business bailout is nothing more than socialism for the rich. The worst consequences of this bailout will take place over the next 1 or 2 years as corporate consolidation, monopolization, and greater inequality take their course. So while we talk about reviving the economy and getting back to where we were, recognize that it is the economy that has gotten us here and now. I would argue that this is not a crisis in the midst of capitalism, or even the failure of capitalism. This is capitalism. So let me ask you, what would an alternative look like? Let's consider the case of Cuba. By March 21st, Cuba had sent healthcare professionals to 37 countries to collaborate in combating the pandemic. Italy received 53 Cuban medics who had experience working in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak of 2014. Cuba also stepped into the breach in mid-March when a cruise ship with over 600 mostly British passengers and a handful of COVID-19 cases were left stranded for a week after the U.S. and neighboring countries refused them permission to dock. Cuba let them in, treated the sick, and assisted their transfer on flights home. Thus, Cuba's taking a leading role in tackling this global pandemic. So how is it that a formerly colonized, imperialized, small Caribbean island that has suffered punitive extraterritorial sanctions by the United States for more than 60 years has so much to offer the world? According to Helen Yaffe, who wrote an article in Counterpunch on April 10th, Capitalist governments have adopted emergency powers in response to the pandemic and introduced them as a last resort in societies where neoliberalism have put down deep economic and ideological roots. For decades, we've been told that the only solution is the free market and its efficiencies. But now this global health crisis brings that very concept into question. The Cuban contribution demonstrates that a socialist state can achieve efficient outcomes measured by societal need, not by private profit. Cuban biopharma is driven by public health demand. Profit is not sought domestically because the sector is completely integrated with the state healthcare system. So the sector has been characterized by the fast track from research and innovation to trials and applications. And we saw that very directly in Western New York because they've been partnering with Roswell Park and Dr. Kelvin Lee, the director of immunology there. He, and I quote, says, "They start with identifying a need, then figure out the science to develop that in the lab, manufacture their agent, test it in the Cuban medical system, and then commercialize it and sell it overseas." Capitalism provides what is superfluous, according to the Italians, while socialism provides what's necessary. This was the message that was sent, expressing their gratitude for Cuba's support in the fight against COVID-19. So what I would like to conclude with is a reflection on neoliberalism. Dawson Barrett's The Defiant is an excellent read on this topic, and he sees the following characteristics repeatedly playing out in a neoliberal agenda: undercutting of worker rights, anti-immigration legislation, tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation of industry, cuts to public service, privatization of public resources. Social Darwinism and neoliberal narratives that blame and scapegoat the poor. It repurposes United States government as a tool for big business and transfers into private hands the massive public wealth that accumulated in the welfare state of the mid-20th century. It re-regulates the economy in favor of corporations. And by the way, this is a bipartisan initiative. It's not a conservative initiative. It's not a liberal initiative. It has succeeded across the board in making the rich much richer. From the 1970s to today, the richest 1% of Americans roughly doubled both their share of the nation's income and their share of the nation's wealth. So neoliberalism does not seek small government. It doesn't seek across-the-board reduction of government rules. It doesn't reward individual merit or competition. What will this look like in the midst of this pandemic? We should expect to see, and I think I've already pointed out examples of increases in corporate lobbying power, freedom to finance political campaigns, direct access to the legislative process, functioning of U.S. government as a corporate proxy, and that means trillions of dollars of taxpayer money to corporations, access to resources and cheap labor through trade agreements and military force, and the Reagan method, personnel is power. So in other words, appointing of corporate heads to labor posts, to civil rights opponents to monitor civil rights, polluters to head governmental agencies, and environmental agencies in particular, and anti-feminists to oversee women's rights. All examples of cowboy capitalism, savage capitalism, mafia capitalism, Jurassic Park capitalism, casino capitalism, whatever you want to call it. These policies disadvantage and marginalize and perpetuate a system of exploitation and domination in both the domestic and the international contexts. It is centered on competition, unfair competition, and thrives in conflict. I personally don't want to return to normal. If this is what restoring the economy looks like, I want no part of it. I'm with those who see this pandemic as the start of a revolutionary change in the world that is premised on mass mobilization, mass cooperation, and mutual aid, and the rejection of business as usual. Business as usual doesn't work for the vast majority of the world